In a world where women were often relegated to the shadows, one decision could change destinies. My name is Abigail, and this is the story of how I faced the recklessness of a foolish man and the fury of an army, guided by a courage I didn't know I possessed. Amid the scorching heat of a desert and the piercing gaze of an enraged warrior, I discovered that true strength lies in listening to the voice within, even when all seems lost. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the curtains of my window, promising another day of hard work. In Nabal's household, wealth was abundant, but peace was rare. I rose as I always did, ready to organize the servants and oversee the daily tasks. Since my marriage, my life had revolved around keeping the house running, often repairing the consequences of my husband's poor decisions. Nabal was a man known throughout the region, though not for admirable reasons. Rich and the owner of vast herds, his fortune seemed only to amplify his arrogance. He was incapable of seeing beyond himself, and his foolishness constantly put everyone around him in danger. That morning, as I checked the provisions, I noticed an unusual movement among the servants. Nervous whispers echoed through the corridors until a young servant rushed to me. His face was pale, and his hands trembled with unease. "Lady Abigail," he began, his voice shaky. "David's men were here. They asked for help, food, water. They said they'd been protecting our lands from raiders." I nodded, signaling him to continue. I had heard of David, the renowned warrior who led fearless men. He was known to be just, but also for his strength and temper. "And what did Nabal do?" I asked, already sensing the answer. The servant hesitated before continuing, as if afraid to say the words. "He insulted them, my lady. Called David a vagabond and said he wouldn't share anything with him." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of Nabal's recklessness. I knew David was not a man to be insulted, especially not so publicly. This affront could cost us dearly, very dearly. That night, while Nabal celebrated and laughed with his friends, oblivious to the danger he had unleashed, I withdrew to my room. My heart was restless, but my mind was already at work. I knew I had to act, because waiting for Nabal to fix his mistake was like waiting for the desert to bloom overnight. The following dawn brought more than light. A servant ran to me, his eyes wide with fear. "My lady, David is coming. He and his men, armed. 400 of them." For a moment, my heart stopped. 400 warriors marching toward our home was not just a threat, it was a death sentence. My first instinct was despair, but I quickly took a deep breath, clinging to the only thing that could sustain me, faith that God would guide me. "Prepare food," I ordered, my voice steadier than I expected. "Load donkeys with bread, wine, meat, and dried figs. Everything we can gather quickly." The servants looked at me with uncertainty, but they didn't hesitate. I knew they trusted me more than they did Nabal, and now their lives depended on it. As the preparations were made, I began to plan what I would say to David. I knew I needed to be more than persuasive, I needed to be wise. My mind swirled with questions and doubts. What if he doesn't listen? What if my intervention isn't enough? But even with these uncertainties, a prayer rose from my lips. "Lord, grant me wisdom. Give me words that will touch his heart. Guide me on this mission." With the donkeys loaded and a few servants by my side, I set out into the desert. Each step felt heavier than the last. The heat was oppressive, and the silence between us only deepened the weight of the situation. Finally, we saw a cloud of dust in the distance. It was David and his men, marching with determination, their swords gleaming under the sun. My heart raced, but I knew there was no room for hesitation. I took a deep breath, dismounted from the donkey, and walked ahead, alone. As I approached, the sound of the soldiers' footsteps seemed to echo in my ears, mingling with the pounding of my heart. When David finally stopped before me, I raised my eyes to meet his. His gaze was intense, filled with anger, but there was something else, a glimmer of curiosity. I knelt before him, a gesture not only of respect but also of strategy. "My lord," I began, my voice firm yet humble, "please hear the words of your servant." When I lifted my gaze to David, I felt the tension around us like a taut rope ready to snap. He was surrounded by his men, their expressions hardened, their swords poised to fulfill their oath of vengeance. The dust swirling from their march mingled with the desert heat, making the moment even more suffocating. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of curiosity and, perhaps, restraint. "My lord," I continued, carefully choosing each word, "the fault is mine. If I had known your men had come, I would have provided everything they asked for without delay." David remained silent, but I knew he was listening. I took a deep breath and pressed on. "Please, do not let the foolishness of one man tarnish your honor. My husband, Nabal, as his name suggests, is a fool. But you, my lord, are chosen by God. One day, you will reign over Israel. Do not let this incident weigh on your conscience when that day comes." My words were filled with emotion, but I kept my voice steady. I knew David was a man of principles. If I could appeal to his honor and sense of justice, perhaps he would relent. "Accept this gift I have brought for your men," I said, gesturing to the servants who stood nearby with the provisions. "Let it soothe your anger and remind you that the Lord fights your battles. Do not stain your hands with unnecessary bloodshed because of a man like Nabal." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. My heart pounded so loudly it felt like it echoed across the desert. David's expression shifted subtly. The anger in his eyes began to soften, replaced by something I couldn't quite decipher. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm but no longer filled with fury. "Blessed are you, Abigail, and blessed is the Lord who sent you to me today. If not for your words, I would have committed a great wrong and shed innocent blood." Relief washed over me like a wave. My knees trembled as I rose. "Thank you, my lord. May the Lord continue to guide you in all your battles." David ordered his men to retreat. As they withdrew, I felt a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. I had faced the impossible and emerged victorious, but a storm still awaited me at home. The journey back home felt longer than the trip to the desert. The tension from facing David had subsided, but my mind was heavy with the next challenge. How would Nabal react when he learned what I had done? Would he understand that I had saved his life and our household? Or would his arrogance blind him once again? When I finally arrived, the sight before me was an affront. Nabal had organized a banquet at our home, a true display of ostentation. He was surrounded by friends, laughing and drinking as if he were a king. The sound of their laughter and music echoed through the walls, each note more grating than the last. I stood at the door, observing the scene with a mix of anger and weariness. He had no idea of the disaster I had just averted. His reckless actions had nearly destroyed us, yet he celebrated as if the world revolved around him. A servant approached me with a concerned expression. "My lady, should I speak to him?" I shook my head. "No. He is drunk." Any words now would be in vain. That night, I withdrew to my quarters, but sleep did not come easily. Images of the desert, of David and his men, intermingled with the vision of Nabal and his feast. I knew I couldn't delay the confrontation for much longer. He needed to know what had happened, not for his sake, but for the sake of everyone who lived under our roof. The next morning, as the sunlight illuminated the corridors of the house, I found Nabal still groggy from his drunken stupor. He muttered something about the party, his voice irritated by the noise of the servants cleaning up the remnants of the night before. I approached him calmly, but my resolve was unshakable. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm. He looked at me, confused, but he did not protest. I recounted everything, from David's request to the army he brought. I explained how I intercepted David's march, pleaded for mercy, and prevented the destruction of our household. Each word seemed to weigh on him like a stone, his face growing paler with every detail. When I finished, he tried to speak, but no sound came out. His breathing became irregular, his eyes wide with terror. Suddenly, he fell backward, as if the weight of his own recklessness had finally crushed him. I stood still, watching as the servants rushed around Nabal. They tried to lift him, call his name, but he did not respond. His breathing was shallow, almost non-existent. The burden of his actions seemed to have finally taken its toll, suffocating him. "Lay him on his bed," I ordered, my tone surprising even myself. It was not despair, nor urgency. It was the firmness of someone who knew this was inevitable. The days that followed were filled with silence. Nabal lay motionless, trapped between life and death. His body was there, but his presence felt absent. The servants whispered in the corridors, speculating about the cause of his condition. Some believed it was divine punishment, others thought the truth had been too much for him to bear. I devoted myself to managing the household. There was no time for mourning or prolonged reflection. Whatever happened to Nabal, the house had to continue functioning. But in moments of solitude, I prayed, not for his recovery, but for wisdom. I knew that life as I knew it was about to change, and I needed to be prepared. 10 days later, Nabal died. His death was not accompanied by tears or lamentations. The servants were somber, but not sorrowful. It was as if everyone had accepted that this was the natural conclusion of his life. As I oversaw the preparations for his burial, I felt a mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also a sense of emptiness. For years, my life had revolved around fixing Nabal's mistakes, protecting our household from his recklessness. Now, with him gone, what lay ahead? That night, I withdrew to the courtyard, where the starry sky stretched like a vast tapestry above me. The silence was deep, but not oppressive. I knelt there, under the stars, and prayed. Lord, thank you for guiding me this far. I trust that you have a plan, even though I cannot yet see it clearly. Give me strength and wisdom to move forward. It did not take long for news of Nabal's death to reach David. A few days after the burial, a group of messengers arrived at my door. Their expressions were serious but respectful. "Lady Abigail," said the leader of the group, bowing slightly. "Lord David has sent us with a message. He has heard of your wisdom and courage, and he wishes to honor you. He invites you to become his wife." For a moment, I was speechless. The invitation was not only unexpected, it was transformative. David, the future king of Israel, saw value in me. He recognized what I had done, not just to save my household, but to preserve his honor. I asked for time to reflect. Not because I doubted David's sincerity, but because I needed to understand what this meant for me. That night, I walked through the grounds around the house, feeling the earth beneath my feet as a reminder of everything I was leaving behind. Accepting David's invitation meant more than changing my life. It meant abandoning what I knew, even if it had been marked by pain and sacrifice. But it also meant embracing a new journey, guided by the certainty that God was leading the way. The next morning, I summoned the messengers. When they arrived, I looked at them with a mix of serenity and determination. "Tell David that I accept. I am ready to walk beside him." As I packed my belongings to leave, I felt a wave of emotions. Leaving the house where I had lived for so many years was difficult, but what it represented, submission, silent struggles, sacrifices, was no longer part of who I was. When I departed, I felt the weight of the past slipping away. My heart was light, filled with a peace I had not felt in a long time. The journey to David's camp was quiet, but within me, there was a storm of emotions. As the desert passed around me, I thought of everything I was leaving behind and the unknown that lay ahead. Nabal's house, with all its burdens and struggles, was no longer mine. Now, a new chapter was about to begin. When I saw David's camp in the distance, my heart quickened. The horizon was filled with orderly tents, lit fires, and men busy with their tasks. Everything there seemed to pulse with purpose, so unlike the house I had left behind. The sounds of the camp were vibrant and alive, and despite the weariness of the journey, I felt a new energy stir within me. When I arrived, I was led to the main tent, where David awaited me. When our eyes met, I saw something in his gaze that I did not expect, genuine respect. He did not see me as just a woman who had confronted him in the desert, but as someone he could trust. "Abigail," he said, his voice firm yet warm. "Your actions were both courageous and wise. You not only saved your household but also prevented me from committing a grave error. I want you to walk beside me, not as a servant, but as a partner." His words touched me deeply. Life with Nabal had taught me to hide my feelings, to endure without showing weakness. But there, before David, I felt I could be genuine. "My Lord, I accept your invitation with gratitude. May the Lord guide us together in all that lies ahead." The days that followed were a period of transition. Learning to live among warriors, in an environment so different from what I knew, was not easy. Yet, there was something comforting in the order and purpose of that place. David's men respected me, and over time, I began to feel like part of their world. One quiet evening, as the camp settled under the glow of the stars, David invited me to walk with him. The fresh desert air felt lighter that night, and the silence between us was comfortable, almost intimate. He looked at the sky and spoke, almost to himself, "Sometimes, when I look at the stars, I'm reminded of how small we are in God's grand plan. And yet, He knows us by name." I nodded, absorbing his words. It's a reminder that no matter how lost we may feel, He always knows where we are and where we're meant to go. David turned to me, a calm smile on his lips. "Abigail, your wisdom is a gift, and I am blessed to have you by my side. You are unlike anyone I imagined, and yet, it feels as though God always intended for us to be here." As he spoke, I felt a profound peace, as if something within me was finally falling into place. For years, my life had been marked by silent struggles, sacrifices, and challenges that seemed insurmountable. But there, under the stars, I realized that all of it had prepared me for this moment. As we walked back to the camp, I thought about the future. There would be challenges, of that I was certain. But there was also hope. Beside David, with God guiding us, I knew we were ready to face whatever came our way. My story with Nabal had ended, but my true purpose was only just beginning.